Hi, I'm Ray Johnston. Constant change means we need to continuously reimagine our way of living. And this way of thinking about renewal and change, it needs leadership and willingness to challenge business as usual practices within government. The Connecting with Country framework is for developing connections with country that can inform the planning, design and delivery of built environment projects in New South Wales. And it took 5 years to complete. And as our continent faces the challenge of natural events like fires, floods, drought, it is crucial to plan ahead by allowing water flows to replenish soaks and lakes and underground reserves during dry periods, by adopting a cool burning approach throughout the year that can help us manage bushland effectively. The destruction of cultural heritage by mining and development is obviously a significant concern, and both international and national policy, they provide guidance for addressing these issues. The UN rights of Indigenous peoples recommend self-determination, ancestral land rights, cultural preservation and redress for past dispossession. Now, today you will hear from our panel why there is a need to address these issues with urban planning and design, and how the Connecting with Country framework was developed. Now, to talk with us today about the Connecting with Country framework, we have Dylan Combermary, we have Alison Page, and we have Dr. Danielle Romek. Now, first, I would like to ask Dylan to do an acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Ray. I'd like to acknowledge country by paying my respects to the Burra people on whose land we're meeting today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and in fact extend that respect to all of our mob across this country. I'd also like to thank and respect Ray, Danielle and Alison for joining me today on the panel. And in the making of the framework, over those 5 years, it's been a hard slog. We've worked with Aboriginal community reps, Aboriginal organisations and consultants, so I'd like to thank them. And also, just to leave you with this thought, that wherever we are all always on country. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks so much, Dylan. Now, we're all mob here sitting on this couch, so I'd like to greet you like mob. Let's start with who's your mob, where you're from, and also tell me a little bit about what you've contributed towards the framework.
So my mob are the Budawang people of the Yuin Nation, and I've also got some heritage in the Sydney Basin, the Burra tribe. So that's the south coast of New South Wales, for those who don't know, and coming up into Sydney. I'm part of the Browns family, which is a big, massive family in New South Wales, spread all the way up the coast, mainly in the coastal areas. I was asked to come on board around 2018, I think, Dylan. It's been a while.
It's a while.
Yeah. And at the time, I was finishing my PhD, and I remember getting this call, I think, do you want to come and do some stuff with the government architect? And I was like, oh, hell yeah. And so I dropped everything and jumped in. We didn't really know at that time exactly what we were developing. We had other names for it. We were doing other processes, but it was all working towards this framework. And my main contribution has been in the research fields, and also doing support work around other parts of the framework, around speaking with community at certain times, at certain points, in the early days especially, bringing in voices from that were present in my PhD that came into the framework, and since then as well, and supporting other bits and pieces around photography and curation and that sort of thing.
So yeah, my mob are the Yugambeh and Quandamooka people from the Gold Coast and Moreton Bay, and I grew up on Mildura Bar, North Stradbroke Island, so a lovely place to grow up. Very small community though, and I found myself in Sydney in my late teens studying architecture and graduating and with the idea of returning actually back to my homelands. But as fate would have it, I stayed in Sydney. I began working with the government architect, worked for 25 years with community, largely Aboriginal community, on their projects. And then more recently, the office transitioned into strategic advice, which was perfect because, we were finding on the ground as design consultants that a lot of decisions had already been made about projects. And it was quite frustrating actually to get what we felt what were the best outcomes for community and for the project. So to be now at the front end of project formation is terrific. Like, it's the best place to be. The highest levels of government are actually asking, what are we thinking about this work? So terrific. So that also culminated in this emerging work, the framework. And Danielle obviously has been a very, very key contributor to this work, and that's why we asked her, and she kindly accepted to come on board. The voice of community is incredibly important within this work. We want them to see themselves in it, and hopefully, we've got the right balance with their voice, but also for non-Aboriginal people actually understanding that it's a collaboration, so they can also see themselves and how it can practically help them do the work that they need to do. My role, I suppose, is co-author of the framework.
I'm from La Perouse in Sydney South, which is a really big community that's made up of a lot of people from, both nations where I'm from. My grandfather's country is down the far south coast, so he's Yuin, and my grandmother's country is Dharawal. So her ancestors were camping right at the Opera House when the first fleet arrived. So their people, occupied the whole of Sydney Harbour, and a lot of them have been moved out to La Perouse. So, a lot of people know Lapa for its sporting prowess. Unfortunately, I'm not sporty. So, the only award I ever got was winning a Lego competition when I was 12. So for me, that was it was logical for me to get into design. And in my final year, that's when I met Dylan and joined Miramar Architecture at the Government Architect's Office with Kevin O'Brien. And I think, a lot of those conversations that we were having in those early days were really about country and about how, our philosophical notions of country fit in with the built environment. And it was then we realised that actually the built environment is an extension of country. So, and then Dylan, my practice now, I do, I'm an Associate Dean at the University of Technology in the Design, Architecture and Building faculty, but my practice now is very multidisciplinary. So I'm a filmmaker, I do public art, and I also work in helping teams develop cultural narratives for projects. So Dylan asked me to make a film that explains this strategy. So that's what I'm doing on this couch right now.
When we're talking about country in this sort of context, how are we defining it?
Country is not definable as far as I can tell. Of course, we know that country's sentient and it's alive, and it's everything we know and everything we don't know. It's everything that we can see and everything that we can't see, and that's how come it's undefinable. Of course, it's the land. Of course, it's the water and the skies, but it's also all of the knowledge to care for the land, water and skies, how to connect to the land, water and skies as well. As Aboriginal people, it's also how we know ourselves. It's how we know who we are. That's why we say I'm a Badawang woman of the Yuin Nation. It identifies us to a place, and to a place that is specific on a specific part of this continent, using a specific language that was born of country, if you want, as well. I think also country, it also gives us our spirit and our spirituality. It gives us our connection and our way of being in the world. It's also home, like it's how we feel belonging and get wellness and get well-being, but it's where our spirits will return when we're not in these bodies any longer. I think elders also say, quite simply that we belong to country, it doesn't belong to us, which is a very different understanding in terms of ownership and property than a Western system has. And I think this is where some of the misunderstandings come from about country, that it is something that if you can define it, perhaps maybe you can own it. Yeah. It's much more than that, of course. I don't even know how to start. I wrote a PhD and didn't get there.
Fair enough. Now, how can country be experienced in urban settings? When people think of country, they think of the country, rural areas, regional areas, but it's everywhere.
It is. Even up here where we are on the 11th floor, we're on country. Of course, elders, when I was doing my PhD, they gave me a lot of time. It was when, at a time when they had more time, I think, than what we currently have. And they said, "Yeah, Barb, of course you're on country wherever you are." And they kind of told me off nicely that, you're even though you're here in the city, you're on country. Just ask your ancestors for help. Ask them for help to connect to country and they'll help you. And I set about doing that in my PhD, and I believe and feel like genuinely that wherever I am, I have the opportunity to connect to that place. Of course, it's changed. Don't get me wrong. I see that I'm not sitting here in a nice bush setting right now. What have I got behind me? Some city urban environment. But even all of this is country. Even the clothes we're made from, the things that we use to build and construct, these sofas, these are all country too, and they have to be cared for as such. Don't get me wrong, it's harder in an urban environment to connect to country, but I think it's really important that we still seek out the spirit and energy of place.
Absolutely. Dylan?
Yeah, I'd like to touch on a couple of concepts or aspects of how I see country within urban settings. If we look at the early post-contact parks and roadways or roads are actually built on the original gathering grounds and pathways built by our ancestors. So that memory of country is still present, even though probably a lot of people don't actually know that. The purpose of country actually does come through as well, particularly in first place names, such as Parramatta or Parramatta, the place where eels rest or lie down. Literally Burra, the eel, Matta, the water place. They're fascinating. I find language actually really fascinating. Yeah. In fact, linguists like Noam Chomsky actually says that language is a form of communication from within the brain. So the purpose of language isn't just to speak, it's actually to translate or transfer thought.
Yeah.
So if you speak another language, say Latin languages, for example, they have gender. Immediately, because English doesn't have that gender with a noun, you're thinking differently. And the same is with first languages. So that's why we're encouraging you to listen to first languages if community feel comfortable sharing that language with you, because there is a lot to learn. The first place names can help us with understanding that purpose, as I said, and that can actually inform spatial outcomes, design and planning of our built environment. The other thing that's really important to consider is our shared history. So early post-contact is shared history, one affecting the other. We have distinct differences, absolutely, particularly through deep time. But this shared history is a really interesting opportunity for designing with country that hasn't yet been really taken up. So we celebrate particularly our colonial heritage. We less so with Aboriginal cultural heritage. But I think there is a wonderful opportunity as we go forward and we in our future development of the built environment that we do look at this third space, actually the in-between space, the shared history.
So for me, country, like to a lot of our people, is a very multi-dimensional concept. It's as Danielle said, it's the land, but also the sea and the waters and the sky. But it's really about a relationship. So we see country as it is a family member, like it's a family member. So we worry about country. We sing to country. We speak to country on a daily basis. And most of all, which is kind of our whole reason for being, is we care for country. And so our relationship with country is so deep. It's kind of embedded in our cultural activities every day and into our spirituality as well, as Danielle said. So where it gets really sort of interesting and quite complicated is, we all hear about Aboriginal people have stories that are written in the land. Well, what that really means is that in the dreaming, our ancestors laid down ancestral tracks. And they laid down what those tracks are knowledges, because we didn't have the written word. So the way that we would remember the vast amounts of cultural and ecological data that you needed to survive was to wrap them up in elaborate sort of fictional stories, which were dreaming stories. But encoded in those stories is all of these knowledges about plants, about astronomy, about biology, all of the things that you need to know. And it's kind of wrapped up in our ceremony as well. So as you pass through ceremony and law, you would have access to more and more knowledges. And so they're called songlines, but they're basically threads of knowledge that thread the land, the sea and the sky together. But they, to me, are very much a part of the fabric of Australia. They exist in cities as well as in remote areas, and they're very much a part of the consideration when you are bringing in, layers of steel and glass and concrete and things like that, how are your new layers, part of the question for people is, how are your new layers responding to not only the broader cultural landscape? We don't just sort of look at one little plot, of land within a site boundary as we do in our practice, but we think about how can what we make and build amplify and promote these knowledges which we had always written into geographic locations and into the objects that we make and build. So we used to carve them into our objects. And when we make objects, we would have this dialogue with country. And so how can we do that within the practice of design and architecture today?
Before we get into a detailed discussion about the framework, Dylan, could you please give us an overview of what we might find in the document?
Okay, so I've just got a couple of slides that might help summarise the framework. So we've moved from a draft that's been out for a couple of years now, 2020. Mm-hmm. We've now, I'm really excited to say it's now finalised. So it's ready to be launched, and that's hopefully what the webinar is about, is to let people know that it's ready. So the need for the framework, the general process of recording what we find when we dig in the ground, particularly during construction, is well established in the planning process. However, responding to country in the design of places is relatively new. It's a new idea. And it's come largely from recent amendments to our the planning's key legislation, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. which includes promoting protection of Aboriginal culture and heritage and good design. So these are new things. The Act has been around since the 70s, but that's been a real challenge for the industry because 5 years ago, nobody knew what country capital C was, let alone connecting with country, let alone designing with country. So here in this slide, the EP&A Act, as I said, within the Act, they're those new objects. We've responded to that challenge by hosting a forum in 2018. So we got a whole lot of people from industry into the room, and we started to say, well, here is this new objective within the Act. How are we going to help you meet the challenge of addressing those particular objects? And it was a really terrific conversation that we had on that day, really well attended. There was a lot of support for country and for community being sort of brought into the centre of design and planning. But the challenge, as I've mentioned, is how do we do it? So we released this discussion paper called Designing with Country shortly after, and that's when we realised that it was a jump too far too soon. And as I said, people actually didn't even understand at that time what country was, let alone how to connect and then respectively design. So we launched the draft in 2020, and that's the work that particularly Danielle helped with very early on with research and all of that wonderful knowledge that she has in conversations with her community, well networked up and down the coast, and with Alison and with others, to put forward what country is, why it's important that we understand country to understand country if we want to work with community, and most importantly, how do we connect with community and country before we start to design with country. So of course, you can hear it coming over the last couple of years. People are very impatient. They want it, the industry particularly, that's what they do best. They want to draw and design and kind of get on with it. But we said this is a period that's actually ongoing. It never stops. The kind of cultural awareness is a life learning process for all of us, actually. This idea of culture and science being a pathway for connecting non-Aboriginal people into our world was actually a really useful tool, because in my early conversations I was saying how knowledge is the basis for both.
Yeah.
And if we could find examples of how cultural knowledge and Western science were actually quite similar, then we could help people kind of work together, both from an Aboriginal community perspective, but also from the project team and the non-Aboriginal person's perspective. So this diagram actually has been the most useful diagram that we've shared with others. This idea of moving from a human-centred approach, which is really, when I went through architecture school, this was seen as a good thing.
Really?
Human-centred design.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Still is.
Yeah. So what they're trying to say is it's not about the building or the object. You've got to think about the people that use the building. But it can get corrupted, and this is the corruption of that, is that people place themselves above country and the environment and nature and all other living things, and that they're there to benefit us. And so to move to the Aboriginal worldview of a country-centred approach is that there is a mutually beneficial relationship, that if we care for country, then country will care for us. So that's got a lot of traction, and that's a really key concept within the framework.
Are people open to hearing that?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Like it's not so new. And that's the thing, is we're saying to people, we have this worldview, but I think even within all other cultural contexts, there is this idea of, it came from a diagram by Stefan Lehrmann, actually, a German architect, I think. where it was actually originally branded ego, that's the triangle,
Yes.
and eco. So this moving from the human as the egocentric approach to the built environment to a much more environmentally sustainable approach. So that's very well socialised now within the built environment. And we've leveraged off that to enhance it by saying, let's go even further to a country-centred approach. Now, this is another really key diagram that's emerged quite recently. It's called the cognitive triangle, and it's what behavioural therapists use to help people overcome, perhaps something that has happened, a traumatic thing that's happened in somebody's life. And so there's a fear of doing something, maybe the thinking of maybe you've been in a car accident and there's a fear of driving. And so behavioural therapists will help that person overcome the fear of driving through thinking differently about it. Like, it's a very rare thing to have happened. It has passed. Lots of people get into their car. You once did. You're a good driver. So the thinking then helps the behaviour. And so we're leveraging off this tool, a Western science tool, and we've got similar ways of thinking about this within our Aboriginal knowledge system. So communing with nature, sensing, communing with country, sensing country, and being on country. Very similar dialogue and very similar ways of thinking of it, bringing that together as a way to make the change from the triangle to the circle. And then finally, the way projects are delivered. This is a fairly standard project life cycle that has the 4 stages of forming a project, designing the project, delivering it, and maintaining it. We're encouraging project teams to start working with community and using language that community is familiar with. So community might might refer to forming as starting with country, starting to know country, connecting with country, that sort of idea. And then designing with country is imagining on country. And then delivering is shaping country, a bit like what we were talking about earlier on. The material comes from country, you make on country, it belongs to country. And then finally maintaining, caring for country. So using the language that community is familiar with if you want to work with community. So that's really important. And the framework has a whole series of recommended actions. One of the key ones is walking on country. So this idea, the neuroscientist tells us that animals learn. We're animals. We learn best by moving. We gather spatial information. We interpret this in the brain. The vestibular system kicks in, and it sends that information to the front of the brain where problem solving occurs. And then from there, memory retention kicks in. So we've known this as the best learning tool for thousands of years. We walk country, we read country, we sing up country. All of these tools help us take in vast amounts of information, but exchange and share that with others. So we're saying that instead of this tool that we use within our profession, the sight analysis, is largely engaging just the eyes, what we see, and it's quite a static thing. It relies on surveys and maps and things. So walking country is a tool for the sight analysis that takes in the hearing, the smell, the listening, all of the senses, and the moving helps you then to take that information much more meaningfully into the way you interpret the sight.
And makes it emotional too.
Yeah, and the emotional side and all the other senses. I mean, the 5 senses that we kind of typically talk about, that's the Western 5 senses. But, in an Aboriginal worldview, there are many more senses that kick in, cultural, spiritual, a whole range of other things. So if we do all of that in the framework, we're saying that the key outcome is to support healthy country. Because if we have healthy country then can support us, healthy communities. We can develop our cultural competency. We can protect our Aboriginal cultural heritage. And as you mentioned, Ray, our sort of most important cultural sites are disappearing and being destroyed, and we have to do all we can to protect them. And then finally, if we do that, then we have the better places that we're also hoping to achieve. Designing with Country, last couple of slides, there's a whole stack of stuff in there around some guidelines and some considerations for how to do that based upon building this foundational knowledge. We talk about a multi-scale, precinct scale, building scale and small project scale, all laid into one another and belonging to, as you said, Alison, a broader cultural landscape. So not to think about the boundaries, that's a colonial concept. It's always the interconnections that go on and on. And then finally, we've got a series of case studies that help people actually, because that's the thing, we can understand the concepts, but ultimately what really helps you in that understanding are the real case examples. So that's a bit of a summary.
A lot of work's gone into that. Congratulations on pulling it all together.
Yeah. That's what we were joking. 65,000 years.
Exactly. So now, who's going to pick it up and use it, and how are they going to use it? How will it be practically implemented?
So it's for everyone. So for the community, the Aboriginal community, it's to help with their spatial understanding of how does design and planning projects happen and the processes of doing that. It's for project teams to help with build their cultural awareness. So slightly different things for different people. It's to help government clients become better clients. And for developers to develop their proposals to respond to Country, and then for assessment teams that receive those proposals to help them understand how they can then make decisions upon those proposals. So slightly different things for different people, but essentially for all of us.
Yeah, really broad range of people that it will be really useful for.
Well, and I was just thinking, like during your presentation, you're talking about the built environment, but in fact, it's got something in it for all Australians, because even if you're designing your own home, your own like a product, I think this is really about thinking about Australia in a very different way and saying until you understand the stories of this land, then you'll never truly belong here. That's ultimately, what it's about, is about this sense, this invitation, this very generous invitation from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to say that, for you to care for this place, you need to worry about it like we do.
Yeah.
And you need to connect to it. And then when you do, you'll belong here.
Yeah. Danielle, would you say that is the message that you're hoping people take away from this framework?
Yeah, that's part of it. And it's also, from that, it's about how do we, as both a community, a broader community, but also a part of a big network of communities that are, most of them not even human, actually get along better and care for each other better, because invariably without those networks of complex organisms working together, we're all on the slippery slide down, unfortunately. And, Country's been giving us some pretty major warning signs about that slippery slide and about how poorly we're doing at the moment and how we must do better. And inevitably, without the health and well-being of Country, nobody has health and well-being. And I think we can sense that, all of us. We're all talking about climate change, but invariably we're not making the actions enough.
Yeah.
And it's bigger than just climate change. It's bigger than just climate change, the change that needs to happen. Yes, that's a driving factor, but I think it's also about how we are caring for each other and our planet as a part of a bigger network.
As part of our everyday cultural, our everyday practices.
Yeah.
So that's the holistic order that Aboriginal people live by. That sort of coherence to nature is beautifully interwoven with everyday thinking, activities, and that's what we want to invite people to be a part of.
One of the slides there talked about Aboriginal knowledge systems, Western science, how it's all connected by that underlying knowledge is really that commonality here. What is the significance of those connections within this project? How does it come out to play?
Well, in a practical sense, it really is how do you do design and planning well? If you have the thinking, the knowledge to respond to a challenge or a problem that's presented, like, we've got a new school that we need to build or a new highway, how does the knowledge that is not enough within the sort of the Western science, business as usual way of doing things, how do you invite different ways of thinking? Because the cultural mindset is a human condition, and it's sort of it's more fixed if you're the more expert you are in something, because it's been tested and proven, and you think that's the only way you can do it. So in answer to that question, it's really how do you solve problems?
Yeah.
And you solve those problems by opening up your thinking and stepping outside of these cultural mindsets. We all have them. We have them as well. And so that's the invitation as well within the framework. Another invitation is working together, and actually not thinking so much about the black and the white, but respecting one another and the knowledge that we have to offer to solve the problem. And through that, you build the relationships, and all these other good things come out of it, including ultimately a good design project.
Yeah.
I think as well, when we're working with communities, they will see the big picture, and often architects, planners, designers, they go straight to the problem.
Right.
And so having that big picture and going, hang on a second, look at all of this that's around it that can provide you with answers to your thing you're looking for a solution, whatever it might be for. That's actually part of the richness of that question of bringing those two cultural ways into one.
I'll riff off that a little bit. Alison, you remember when we were at Wilcannia, we had a lot of conversations out there about, remember the wavy line and the straight line, and the project managers wanting to get straight to the end on a straight path. And it's actually when you get outside of the sort of the obvious and the pre-planned almost, that the solutions is it's a bit like what we're saying about the different ways of thinking and bringing different people to the table. It's actually going out, like you're saying, Danielle, out as we do, beyond the actual problem to come, once you're out, to come back in. Because sometimes it's when you sleep on something as well.
Yes. Yeah, it's just tap you on the shoulder.
They say, here is the answer.
Never make a big decision without sleeping on it first. You never know what'll come to you.
Girawa was the first sort of, major project I did with the community.
Yeah.
And that came in a dream. So I kept on thinking that the solution was in a particular way, and suddenly it's like something came into my head after visiting the place, actually. So ancestors maybe
probably
from there.
That happens to me. I'm like woken up at 2:30 going, excuse me. But that's for other things as well. Like if I've gone, I'm not going to deal with that. They're like,
but pen and paper out.
That's on that project circle. That's the imagining. I sort of kind of couched it in that, but it's a dreaming almost, like to allow the other, like the extension when you go out, as you say, out, that's where you can actually find the answers.
I wish I could remember who said this to me, because I want to really acknowledge them, but I can't. But they said, in past times we didn't walk in straight lines. If you think about it, when you're walking on country, if you walked in a straight line, you'd fall down a cliff, hurt your ankle, smash into a tree, tumble over a rock. So walking in a straight line is actually crazy. strange behaviour. And if you can imagine all these straight lines that we now put onto maps and now into the landscape, how crazy that must have been for our mob in the original times. But it's still crazy now to think that we can go in a straight line.
But in a way, I think that what we deal with every day in our work is this tension between traditional knowledges and Western science.
Yep.
Because when that endeavour sailed in and met those two ancestors there at Kamay, what sailed in was empirical science.
Yeah.
And that was sort of an invasion of sort of a different way of thinking and different ideas, which has been very valuable to humanity, and that applied science. Look at the technology we've got now. But the gift of traditional knowledges to empirical science, because the flip side of that was that everything in the natural world got divided into taxonomic classifications. Mm-hmm. And I think that's expanded to even industries, our industry. Mm-hmm. Architects are separate from landscape architects, separate from... So everything's
siloed from each other.
Exactly. And I think that that's probably why it's so difficult for people to sort of take that step up and think about things in a more holistic way. But it will be a gift to Western science. And I think the cultural inheritance for all Australians of our culture to them is that I think we can build a world where we have the best of traditional knowledges, which has this relationship to nature, and the best of Western technology. And frankly, we need Western technology to help boost the work that our traditional ecological relationship did. We need to boost it because we need water to be cleaner than it's ever been. We need the air quality to be better. And we've got so many endangered species that we're going to have to get pretty clever about the way we solve these problems. And so it's the beauty and the design is where those two things intersect for me.
Yep.
So what does it mean at its core to design with country? If you needed to explain it to someone, what does it mean?
Design qualifications and a relationship with country put together.
Yeah.
And a design outcome should come from those two, the experience of having some qualification, but also having the ability to relate to the land and to the ability to understand the stories, the ability to interpret those into the design.
The rider on that is, we want to be very careful that everyone understands that caring for country, connecting with country, designing with country, these are cultural terms. And, as often happens, sort of a hip thing or term comes into the dialogue and everyone wants to use it and they want to take it. Well, they can't. They can't just take caring for country, connecting with country and designing with country. They have to be endorsed and authorised by the Aboriginal community who are working with those project teams, because we are hearing already that people saying, oh, we've got this, we're now designing with country. Well, no, you're not, because it means more than just the mechanical thing of producing a design. Like, it involves the relationships, it involves the authorisation from the community. It's like the spirit of country needs to give permission for this thing to happen, called designing with country. So for me, it's actually that. It's the technical side of being able to deliver the design of a school or a hospital or whatever. That's a design output. But designing with country has all of these other dimensions that are described in the framework, but it is this sort of cultural term that needs to be really respected.
Who's doing it right? Where has it been done successfully?
The blackfellas are doing it.
Yeah. We're all over it.
Obviously.
Finally something we're good at.
But is there anyone who's really coming in and collaborating proper ways and
I think
doing
what's
this
really
respectfully.
exciting from my perspective, just, working in my land here in Sydney, is actually seeing the communities really upskilling around
good.
architecture and design.
Yep.
And, I was just out at La Perouse this morning, and they're looking at, getting more young people into design and architecture and upskilling, because they can see the potential, I think, of doing what our ancestors did. The ancestral beings, they shaped the land.
Yeah.
They embedded ancestral tracks and knowledges into country. And so, in a way, if you've got all these layers of steel and glass now in this metropolis of Sydney, we have to just be really super creative about how we can continue that work and tap into the energies that were left behind by those ancestral heroes and amplify those song lines again. And so for me, I look at the work that these traditional custodians are doing, and I get really excited about the kind of city Sydney could be.
Yeah.
And then I think once you start seeing communities do this really well, it's going to make our job a lot easier as practitioners because it's our role to kind of help them co-design this.
They've had such...
Sorry, Ray. Sorry, Danielle. I just, because it just came in and I'll lose it, lose the thread of it.
Say it now.
Get it out.
I have to say it now. But I sort of consciously avoided the answer to your question, who is doing it well, consciously, because culturally, this is how I would approach it. Culturally, we have the tall poppy syndrome. That's the negative of it. But the positive of it is that it is a collective force.
Yep.
And so to kind of mark out somebody as being exemplary is probably not the cultural way for us to do that. We are working collectively. So if we were to have this session, me, you, one-on-one, I would feel very uncomfortable with that. And there are many more that could be in the room. But I think it's really important that at least, this is a show of a collective voice in this work, and the same. There will be many people who will do this well, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal actually. But we don't want to single out somebody in particular, because that's just not how it works. We all benefit from the knowledge that we share with one another. And it's more about the sort of the collective.
The collective
Absolutely.
consciousness. We're trying to change the industry. I mean, the way, even from day one, the way projects are run, we have to
Before
kind
day
of,
one.
we have to say, hang on a sec, like we need to do the squiggly line, not the straight line, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the beauty of this guide and this framework is that that's already put that sort of squiggly line sort of concept into people's minds. So we're not fighting for it like we used to.
Yep.
But, right? And also I think the more we do this, the more the value is being demonstrated to landowners, to developers, to government, to even citizens who who get to live in these places that are rich in culture, and they have, Aboriginal people maintaining it and coming in and activating it with ceremony and interesting cultural activities. Like that, I think is kind of going to be the sort of payoff in the end of this community that we have that are trying to collectively drive this.
That's right. Well said.
So here's another question that might be challenging. How do you measure the success of a framework like this? Because success is something that is approached in very different ways with Western thinking and with Indigenous thinking. So how do you say, yes, this has been done well?
We've spoken a little bit about this. I think measuring and government, all sorts they want to measure things, and I suppose here's where we are and here's where we want to go.
A plus.
Yeah, that's
ticking boxes.
It's cool, isn't it?
It is,
ABC,
yeah.
So there is a use in it, but in this space, it's more what it looks like as opposed to how it's measured. I think it's something that we need to constantly be working on and being involved in, and not necessarily have marks that tell us how well we've done necessarily. I think it's more about a direction, moving in a direction that's positive, as opposed to these sort of marks in the sand, a marking of your place and time, because, again, if probably from my personal perspective, probably shared, if you talk even about time is a really...
Don't get me started.
But it's sort of like that. It's more, I think, about a movement in a positive direction.
You don't ever want to say, "Oh, we've arrived.
We've done it."
No.
Done it.
No.
No, because I think, if we do get to a place in Australia where we're not importing architectural styles from other places and borrowing landscape styles from other places, and looking secondhand American and secondhand England, that we actually have an Australian design that is built from country.
Yeah.
Where communities and traditional custodians are being invited to culturally govern their land again. And that means having a seat at the table of development authorities and people who look after country, if they're being invited to be part of that
voice.
conversation. And if country is healthy, then I think, we're definitely on the path, but it's, it's a way of living, I suppose, that we want, Australians to be part of, really.
Absolutely. What does the future look like when this framework's launched, Danielle? Ideal.
Blue sky thinking. Come on.
Oh my gosh. I think that it looks like communities seeing themselves reflected back in the built environment, and country looking like what we're working on, the forms and buildings are built birthed from country, the country sort of gave birth to them, it genuinely looks like it's of its place. And that built environment professionals all have relationships with country that are genuine and meaningful, and with the communities that they've been working with, and that we actually have in a big sky thinking, a whole other way of doing architecture that is formed from this place, that makes meaning from this place and starts with the spirit of this place, because it's a long way from that right now, but I think that's a really incredible aspiration that we could work towards. And that communities, when they see a work and they go, that's perfect, that belongs here.
I can see it. I love it. Alison?
I think the world has already changed for me. I've got to give props to you, Moj, about...
No, we're not going to call out
No. I am going to call out this fellow here, though, because to me, I walk into projects now, and you experience this as well, it's where people are talking about tiny insects. On day one of a project, or, we're talking about... inviting communities in to do these festivals and ceremonial practices before we've even drawn anything on the page. So for me, I never thought I'd see that, especially this soon.
It has happened really rapidly, actually.
Yeah.
Like Circular Quay or Macquarie Street East.
Yeah. Bays West. Bays West, we're going to create an increase site for a tiny little seahorse.
Yeah.
And I think about that, and I think my ancestors would be so proud of that I think I must have a little bit of the seahorse spirit left in me, because to have that opportunity to do that, to me, I'm just so grateful for that, because to me design can be an act of power. And, design can be this amazing vehicle for social justice. And I think to be a part of that, and this framework has allowed that to happen, is incredible. My aunties and uncles are starting to talk this architectural language, and it's kind of a trip to me, to be honest. But it's a beautiful thing. And so I think we're closer than we think we are. It's a little bit like when the sustainability and architecture movement sort of started.
Yep.
It was all a bit patchy, there in the beginning. But as people got their heads around it, Australia is quite world leading now in terms of sustainability and architecture. And so I think this black architecture, I think it's actually just hang on for the ride, because, I just don't think, thanks to you and all your collaborators there, and the will from state government as well has made this happen.
Perfect.
Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for on this chat. I would like to keep talking for another hour if possible, but we do need to kill the cameras. So the future of the built environment holds immense potential to address and respect Aboriginal cultural heritage while fostering harmony with nature, responding to climate change, protecting sacred sites, reducing waste, and restoring habitats of endangered species. As society becomes more aware of the importance of these interconnected aspects, significant changes are expected to shape our built environment and help support the health and well-being of country. Because if we care for country, country will care for us. Thank you.